Hey friends, how you doing? Eric Gillis here. All right, let's zero in on the guy that I really call patient zero in the D.B. Cooper case, and that's this guy right here, a guy named Vince Peterson. Now, Vince Peterson's a guy who, in my opinion, either was D.B. Cooper or he was very close to D.B. Cooper, meaning perhaps he was a colleague of his or somehow ran in the same circles as D.B. Cooper, and this is based upon science. This is based upon science. This is based upon the evidence, at least as far as I understand and as far as we understand it today. And it all really comes down to this item right here. That's right, D.B. Cooper's skinny black JCPenney clip-on tie cost $1.49 when it was purchased new. It was left behind on the jet, retrieved by the authorities in Reno, Nevada, and it tells a story. So, as many of you know, this is a subject that I've talked about at length, specifically the tie particles. Now, this tie obviously was recovered November 24th, 1971, after the skyjacking basically ended in Reno, and it was taken obviously by the authorities and submitted to Quantico, and they analyzed it and so forth. But, again, this is 1971, so there was only so much they could get out of the tie. We're not talking scanning electron microscopes and things of that nature, DNA testing and so forth back in 71 that we have now in 24. So in recent years, of course, the tie has been analyzed at length, primarily by a private scientist, a guy named Tom Kay, who was afforded special access to the evidence, specifically to the tie, on two occasions, once in 2009 and once in 2011. And those particles, some of the particles that were pulled off of the tie and were vacuumed off the tie by Tom Kay, were analyzed in 2017, and they tell a story. They tell a story, and this is the story it tells. It indicates pretty clearly that D.B. Cooper came from a specialty metals environment. It appears that he was a metallurgist working around specialty metals. And I want to focus on a few of the particles, a few of the things that have been found on the tie that indicate this, and really kind of ultimately help me zero in on this patient zero, this Vince Peterson guy, who I find to be a very compelling person of interest. Now, again, to be clear, I don't know if Vince Peterson was D.B. Cooper or not, but in my mind, he either was D.B. Cooper or he was very close to D.B. Cooper, just based upon my understanding of the evidence and the science. So let's get into it a little bit here. So there have actually been quite a few recent developments with respect to the tie and the tie particles. And one of them is in this area right here. Let me throw up a particle here. You see this particle? This is it's a titanium, pure titanium particle, and it's called an acicular titanium particle. And what it actually is a piece of titanium powdered metal. Appears to be a piece of titanium powdered metal rather, obviously, once again, an acicular powdered titanium particle. This was found on D.B. Cooper's tie and clearly photographed. And there were several other particles as well, acicular titanium particles, that were found on D.B. Cooper's tie as well. Here's a blurry picture of some of the titanium particles that were found on the tie, and I've circled some of those kind of blurry but clearly acicular titanium powder particles. Now, why this is interesting is because powdered titanium wasn't commercially viable until the 1980s. It wasn't until the 1980s that you saw companies starting to work with and use powdered titanium for a number of reasons, which I won't get into right now. Now, that said, there was a lot of research that was done on powdered titanium going back into the 50s, into the 60s, and ultimately through the 70s, until eventually they had refined things to the degree whereby the 1980s it became viable as a commercial product. Now, why this is important is because D.B. Cooper's clip-on tie obviously came within the custody of the FBI in 1971. So it begs the question, how is it that DB Cooper is getting pure titanium or alloyed titanium particles, powdered titanium on his tie from the 60s and maybe even as late as 1971, if this stuff wasn't even available commercially for another decade or so? How is that possible? That seems to be a pretty clear indication that where DB Cooper came from was a metallurgical lab that was working on powdered titanium. Makes perfect sense to me. Now, a couple of things that are worth noting here. One of the pioneering companies in this space was a company called DuPont. Yeah, the DuPont company. They actually were looking at powdered titanium and working on this from the 1950s going into the 1960s, and they largely had abandoned the effort by the early 60s. I want to say about 1962. Now, why this is interesting is because they were the parent company, that is, DuPont was the parent company of a company called Rem-Cru Titanium. Rem-Cru Titanium was a company that was owned by Remington Arms and Crucible Steel. And again, DuPont was the parent company of this thing, basically, this Rem-Cru Titanium. Now, Crucible ended up eventually buying out Remington's portion, and the company became known as Crucible Steel moving forward. And it changed its name a few other times down the road, but that's a little bit of the history of this. So it does appear, or at least we have an easy way to understand or explain how somebody working at Crucible Steel, Rem-Cru Titanium, would have come across some of that proprietary work that was done on powdered titanium back in the 50s and into the 60s, and why this would have continued forward or moved forward as time progressed throughout the 70s and ultimately into the 1980s. And again, DB Cooper, it appears, that worked at this company in the 1960s and then obviously into 1970, as late as 1971, even though we're not really sure exactly what happened there. So that's something that's very interesting to keep in mind, the fact that we have a tie with powdered titanium, a acicular powdered titanium on the particles, and what appear to also be other titanium powdered particles on the tie is a pretty clear indication this guy came from a place of sort of rarefied air, if you will, working on metallurgical type of things, specialty metals, that type of thing. And it's also worth considering that titanium itself was very rare in the 1960s and going into the 1970s. Nothing like it is today, where it's in wedding rings, golf clubs, and all the rest. I mean, this, back then in the 60s, titanium in general was primarily used in the aerospace sector and also in the chemical field. So that's where most of the titanium was used back in that area. So the fact that DB Cooper has literally thousands of pieces of titanium on the tie, particles of titanium on the tie, not only commercially pure titanium, but also alloyed titanium, I think tells the story as far as that goes. So that's something very interesting to keep in mind. Now, one other thing that's very interesting to keep in mind here relates to salt. There's a fair amount of salt that was found on the tie as well. Now, this isn't the kind of salt that you get from your McDonald's French fries or whatever. This was a salt that was more of an industrial type of salt. It's worth noting that salt was used as part of creating these acicular particles. That's the one thing. But also salt was used in testing, stress testing, corrosion testing titanium as well. So I'm not really certain, and I don't know that anybody's certain, whether the salt that we see on the tie is a byproduct of creating these acicular shapes and pieces of titanium, or perhaps it's something related to the salt corrosion testing and so forth on titanium. But that's something worth keeping in mind as well. And again, when we're talking about Rem-Cru Titanium / Crucible Steel, they were involved in this business. They were into this kind of thing. So they did a lot of work on that. One other thing that I think is really critically important relates to a few particles of a special alloy, titanium and antimony alloy. an alloy of titanium antimony, which is an exceptionally rare alloy, which was patented by this Rem-Cru titanium and was used on in a couple of other patents of theirs throughout the 1960s. Now, this titanium and antimony alloy was never commercially disseminated. So it appears that the only place that these titanium and antimony particles could have come from, because there was some that were found on D.B. Cooper's tie, was this Rem-Cru titanium and crucible steel. So that is another really compelling piece of evidence that not only points to at large the metallurgical industry, but specifically to this one particular company, Rem-Cru Titanium, later known as Crucible Steel, of course. So that's part of the reason, or part of what makes this all very interesting, and what drives us into specifically this company, again, Crucible Steel. They had a titanium research lab located in Robinson Township in the suburbs of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And importantly, they were the major supplier of specialty metals to Boeing throughout the 60s and into the 70s. Boeing used them. They were their primary supplier of specialty metals that Boeing used in the production of their aircraft, including the Boeing 727. And the Boeing 727 first entered service, public service, in 1964. So it's worth noting that this Robinson Township lab that contained the titanium facility that I mentioned, it opened in 1964. The tie itself was manufactured in 1964 and likely purchased new from JCPenney, I say around Christmas 1964. And then, of course, the Boeing 727 entered service again in 1964. So that 1964 date seems to pop up a lot. So let's talk about Vince Peterson here and why I consider this guy sort of patient zero as far as this is concerned here. Well, I want to show you something here. This here is a picture of a plaque that Mr. Peterson received upon his retirement in 1984. And I've circled a couple of things on here that you may find interesting. One is the HSSC, and then the other one is the PM. Now, the HSSC deals with hot salt stress corrosion. This is something that Mr. Peterson worked on. He actually wrote academic papers on the effects of salt, corrosive effects of salt on titanium. That was one of his specialty things. And remember, there's a fair amount of salt on that tie, which may indicate that D.B. Cooper, for whatever reason, was working around salt. So it would make sense if we're dealing with somebody like a Vince Peterson, who obviously worked on that as well. Now, the PM that is circled relates to powdered metallurgy. Obviously, that's a very compelling these as well, because this is one of Vince Peterson's specialty areas. And you can see the TI in the center there. That means titanium. That was his deal. These are the things that he worked on throughout his career there. So we know that Vince Peterson was involved with powder metallurgy as well. And it's important to note that these engineers that worked in the titanium research lab, they wore ties. They wore ties, and it was a very small group of men back then. My understanding was only about 8, and I'm sure there were some men that came and went over the years, but it was a relatively small group of men who were the engineers, the metallurgists, and they wore ties to work. Now, there were assistants and so forth around them that did a lot of the, honestly, grunt work, so to speak, but they did not wear ties. And this is information that I gleaned from actually one of the supervisors of this titanium research lab. Now, why Mr. Peterson is also intriguing to me is because he was the one person, in addition to the supervisor, that I know traveled to Boeing on multiple occasions, not one occasion, but on multiple occasions, because Boeing was a significant customer for Rem-Cru titanium. So, and I guess actually it's probably the other way around, wasn't it? No, actually that's right. Okay, Rem-Cru was selling them stuff. So yeah, Boeing was the customer as far as that goes, and having a little bit of a mental block here. But nonetheless, obviously the engineers at Crucible Steel were working with the engineers at Boeing as they're developing the 727 in particular and other aircraft, and they're developing parts and so forth that are worked there, that are worked into airplanes and that type of thing. So we can see in the case of Peterson, somebody who was obviously familiar with Boeing, familiar with the Seattle region, because that's where Boeing is located, worked in the powder metallurgy field, worked at the company that produced the titanium and antimony alloy, and that appears to be the only place. Obviously worked with the hot salt stress corrosion and can explain that as well. And plus he physically checks the boxes. A guy who is about the right age. Mr. Peterson would have been 52 years of age at the time of the skyjacking, which is maybe, let's say, 4 years or so beyond kind of the age generally accepted as D.B. Cooper's age. 48 roughly is an average basically of what the witnesses described D.B. Cooper as. The primary witnesses, I think the average age came to 48, so Peterson was 52. And I think that there is enough of a resemblance to the sketch where you have to keep it in mind. You have to consider this guy as a very real candidate for being D.B. Cooper, and if he wasn't D.B. Cooper, somehow knowing who D.B. Cooper was. And that's the important thing here, is that even if Mr. Peterson was not D.B. Cooper, and I do believe we're going to figure this thing out actually within a matter of a few months here, based upon DNA, and I can touch upon that in a second here. The bottom line is that everything still seems to center around that titanium research lab. So perhaps we have a situation where Mr. Peterson's not D.B. Cooper, but it does seem to clearly indicate or strongly indicate, based upon the science, that he was very close to D.B. Cooper. Again, either a colleague in some fashion, somehow rubbed shoulders with this guy. So even if Mr. Peterson's DNA comes back as no way that he could have been D.B. Cooper, this is the area that I'm going to continue to focus on, because that's where D.B. Cooper appeared to have come from. And as new evidence has been developed specifically from the tie, even as late as a couple of weeks ago, it is all still very consistent, and in my mind still clearly points to metallurgical environment, and specifically Rem-Cru titanium / Crucible Steel. It is worth noting, actually, that initially when the titanium and antimony particles were discovered, which I discovered in the data in 2022, so a couple of years ago, there were only three particles of the titanium and antimony that were identified. We had a recent batch of new particle information that came to us, and when I say us, I mean Tom K specifically, but I'm part of that group that's been looking into this. There's 35,000 particles of additional data, some of which appear to be clearly new particles, some which may be overlap particles, but there are actually three new particles, would appear to be three completely new particles of that titanium and antimony alloy baked into the new data as well, which would mean at this point that we have a total of 6 titanium and antimony particles that were pulled from the tie. And it's important to know these are just particles pulled from the tie, either vacuumed or sticky stubbed off. That doesn't mean that that's it. If we had a chance to explore the entire tie, which is currently in FBI custody, it stands to reason there are probably many more particles actually of the titanium and antimony, as well as other things on the tie that we're just unaware of, because just haven't had access to the tie in recent years. So let's talk very briefly about this DNA here, and then I'll kind of wrap this thing up here. So as many of you know, working in conjunction with Tom K, Tom and I do have D.B. Cooper's DNA. No doubt about it. It was vacuumed into a tiny little filter when Tom K vacuumed portions of the tie, and in particular the tie knot. One of those filters was submitted to a lab, and that filter has been analyzed and the data is in place. So I'm hoping to have all the data related to this, to the DNA and everything that came out of it, here within a matter of a few days. Now, what makes this sort of a breakthrough very recently is that the data in and of itself would be very difficult to kind of identify alleles and things of this nature that we could ascribe to D.B. Cooper. Up to this point, it's been very difficult, but there is new software out there. There's new software out there called StarMix that actually has the ability to take a look at this data and identify DNA alleles and things of this nature that we can use for binary comparative purposes for people that are persons of interest or compelling persons of interest in the D.B. Cooper case, such as Vince Peterson. To be clear, it can't 100% prove that somebody was D.B. Cooper, because I think we're working with a partial profile here, and I don't know how much of a partial profile, but a partial profile nonetheless. However, on the other hand, it could 100% eliminate a person of interest. In other words, if there are no alleles that match our particular person of interest, then we can safely say that dude was not D.B. Cooper. So hopefully, when it comes time to analyzing and looking at some of these binary comparisons, and again, patient zero in my mind again is Vince Peterson. Hopefully we'll get some sort of definitive response with respect to it. Either there's absolutely no way he could have been D.B. Cooper based upon the DNA, or if there are alleles that match, we should have a statistical number attached to that, giving us an idea of what's the likelihood that that DNA came from Vince Peterson or that specifically Vince Peterson. But again, one way or the other, that's progress, and an intellectually honest investigation has to basically face the evidence and the results of the analysis and the evidence and everything, come what may. So even if Mr. Peterson comes back as there's no way he could have been D.B. Cooper, I'm absolutely certain that D.B. Cooper came from that very small universe that Vince Peterson was floating around in. There's a very small universe of prospective D.B. Cooper candidates. So I think we're getting very, very close to figuring out who this guy was. Now, I want to say in closing here that this case is moving very quickly. As I referenced the DNA information, I could have literally within a couple of days. The tie particle data, we picked up, new particles data literally a couple of weeks ago. And this is moving at really light speed at this point. So with that in mind, I've launched a new series of live YouTube broadcasts on Tuesdays and Fridays. Basically, I call it the twice weekly update on the D.B. Cooper investigation. So D.B. Cooper investigation twice weekly update, where I'm going to provide in real time provide in real time an update on what's going on with the investigation here. Because I firmly believe that, what makes this exciting, or what is, as far as from following the case is concerned, is the opportunity and the ability to follow this case in real time. I referenced this yesterday in yesterday's YouTube live, that typically when we're talking about cold cases, normally what happens, those that end up being solved, is we read about it after the fact. Case gets solved and you read about it on CNN or Fox, whatever the case may happen to be. Well, we're not there yet. We haven't solved this case, but I think we're getting close. And I think it would be really cool. I think it would be a lot of fun, really entertaining and enjoyable, actually, to afford people the opportunity to follow in real time this investigation as we close in, as we zero in on D.B. Cooper. And as to when we actually figure out who this guy is, I don't know. Is it going to be a couple weeks? I don't know. Is it going to be a couple of years? I don't know. I think we're getting close. So I invite you to not only subscribe to my YouTube channel here, but check back on Tuesdays and Fridays live to watch my twice weekly updates. Or obviously, if you can't see them at live, you can certainly check back and watch the archived version on my YouTube channel page here. So there we go. That's it. That's what I've got for you today, folks. I know it's been a while, so I'm going to try to update you more regularly on this stuff, primarily through the lives. Anybody who's all into the D.B. Cooper case and wants to learn more about it or stay more in touch with it, I invite you to join my Facebook group called the DB Cooper Mystery Group. It is the DB Cooper Group on Facebook. We got nearly 5,000 members of the group, and it's an active group, and it's a really badass group, really cool, very collegial, and some great discussions there. Also, anybody who's interested in CooperCon, which is our annual event, we got the 6th annual CooperCon taking place in Seattle, November 15 through November 17 this year. 3 days of a lot of fun, and you get to hear a lot of interesting people, from passengers on the plane to Tom Kay and myself and others who are doing a lot of investigating in the case. You get to learn about that, hear from them, FBI agents, all kinds of stuff. Really, really cool stuff. If you're interested in that, check out my website, CooperConEvents.com. All that information is there if you want to grab tickets and show up in Seattle and join us, or if you can't make it, but you want to watch it online, there's also an option to do that as well. So that's it. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to shoot me an email at eric@ericulis.com. And until next time, folks, as always, cheers.